As I mentioned in the introduction, my purpose in this part 1 is not to find where we have gone right or where we have gone wrong, but to begin to lay the foundation for where we might do better. And our beginning quote for part 1 comes from the Roman statesman and lawyer Cicero, who said, "Nobody can give you wiser advice than yourself." I think we will see how that is true as we go forward. We can think of our tree of Western philosophy as having two basic roots. One is the Greek philosophers of Athens, and the other the Judeo-Christian works centered originally around Jerusalem. I've decided to start with the Greek roots, but we will discuss the older Judaic origins in our next section. We will begin with Socrates, who we may recognize as more regarded for his ability to ask questions than to give answers. Plato was a student of Socrates, and according to Plato, Socrates was at odds with the sophists. And again, according to Plato, who got to write the dialogues on which we judge the arguments, Socrates was right and the sophists were wrong. Thus, today we have negative connotations to derivative words from the Greek Sophia base, such as sophomore, wise fool, and sophistry, an over-intellectualized approach to an argument. However, the Greek root word Sophia means wisdom. From this we get philosophy, in which philo means love and Sophia means wisdom, the love of wisdom. And so it is important to note these wise men had different ideas than Socrates and not necessarily a bad or wrong approach. Basically, Socrates argued that in regard to ethics, there were absolutes and they could be defined. Thus, ethical standards were teachable, and by being taught, they could then be followed. He based his theories on what has become known as ethical rationalism. Over 2 millennia later, Immanuel Kant would reconfirm that there is only right and wrong, and right must be expected and imposed universally. But in between Socrates and Kant, as well as since Kant, there have been many other views. Going back to ancient Greece, following his mentor Socrates, Plato added the concept of metaphysics, going beyond the known physical world and seeking the truth behind all our illusions of existence. He sought the truths of the higher reality, a reality only a few might be able to grasp. With this superior attitude, Plato would challenge democracy itself and recommend a meritocracy form of government by the specially capable few. Although way ahead of most Greeks of his time, believing women should also be considered for positions of government and leadership, he also disturbingly believed government had the moral right to deceive and control the minds of the people, when the meritocracy few believed it to be in the best interests of the government. This then led Plato's student Aristotle to challenge his mentor as out of touch with earthly reality. Aristotle brought a down-to-earth practicality in regard to human emotion. In this famous painting by Raphael, we see Plato pointing to the perfection from above, and Aristotle insisting we stay down to earth with our expectations. Aristotle firmly believed that the object of life was happiness in whatever form: power, wealth, food, and drink. He believed that success was the end result of a happy life, and ultimate success gives us ultimate pleasure. Aristotle believed virtues would lead to happiness and thus human success. The Roman emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius would take Aristotle's work to the extreme, stating virtue was its own reward. This is certainly going beyond what Aristotle expected when he believed people sought happiness simply because it felt better than unhappiness. From a human motivational standpoint, I tend to agree with Aristotle, and I would suggest the more universal the human desire, such as pursuing our own happiness, the more powerful it must be. So, if we go back just to the more fundamental concept of Aristotle's, that happiness is a primary goal of everyone, and follow it through the centuries, we ultimately come to a founding principle of America itself. If, in fact, the basic human desire is ultimately happiness, then we must arrive eventually at the conclusion that the pursuit of happiness is an unalienable right. John Locke crystallized this concept and personally discussed it with William Penn, who brought the Locke principles of life, liberty, and the right to the fruit of one's own labor with him to America. Although responsible for opening the New World to incredible individual freedom, including the rather radical concept of religious tolerance for everyone, Penn was more in tune with Socrates. He had strong opinions that there was a right and wrong among human action. He stated right is right, even if everyone is against it, and wrong is wrong, even if everyone is for it. But it was Locke's principles of life, liberty, and the right to the fruit of one's own labor that would eventually be a key concept for a growing middle class in colonial America, and become the leading principle of the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson in Penn's beloved Philadelphia. Jefferson simply changed the fruit of one's own labor to the even more Aristotelian concept of the pursuit of happiness, a unique phrase in the founding of any government. Standing in Independence Hall, in the same room where both the Declaration and Constitution were signed, Abraham Lincoln, on his way to become the 16th President of the United States, spoke about the Declaration rather than the Constitution when he said, "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence, and that all should have an equal chance." As we come a century closer to our own time, in the 19th century, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill reshaped Aristotle's views on virtue. Bentham and Mill believed we should always act for the greatest good for the greatest number. Right and wrong were replaced with weighing different amounts of good. Here we start to see the practical approach that will shape 20th century thinking up to our own standards today in the 21st century. We shift from the "thou shalt not" of the Ten Commandments to do the most good for the most people. One key negative of this approach is who determines the value of good. Also, with two variables, we see the subjectivity being swayed between the amount of good and the number of people. We have to balance two potentials in a world where everything is relative. Who decides whether a greater good for fewer people is better than a lesser good for more people? There would come, by the end of the 19th century, the inclusion of the laissez-faire principles into social success. Abraham Lincoln had foreseen the excesses of the Industrial Revolution coming and wrote even while in the midst of the horrors of the nation's Civil War. He stated, "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. As a result of war, corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic destroyed. I feel at this moment more anxiety for the safety of our country than ever before, even in the midst of war." In part, Lincoln's fears came true for America under President Grant's administration, and the Industrial Revolution had many casualties. If we use Locke's labor as a means of accumulating property and combine that with an unbalanced view based on Bentham and Mill of how much good for how many people is correct, we see excesses of rich and poor accumulating during the Industrial Revolution. With excessive greed and excessive poverty throughout most of Europe, Karl Marx countered the Socrates standard that we were capable of doing good by knowing what good is, with the fact that a few would do anything for power and greed. Marx was crying out for fairness in a time when some had temporarily lost their moral compass and replaced it with the pursuit of almighty money and the power it could buy. He saw capitalism and industry destroying the individual's choices, the individual's right to pursue happiness in an industrial environment where mere survival of the working class was extremely difficult. Marx's insight, of course, got caught up in geopolitical struggles, and his genuine intentions were never fully understood. Today, we see Marx's principles as having failed, and indeed, as applied to a totalitarian regime, they are failures. But if an underlying concept of Marxism is from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs, then even though such principles lead to failure in government, business, and economic development, they nonetheless have been the foundation through all the millennia of civilization of the successful nuclear family structure, from the newest born to the eldest grandparent. However, some believe the ultimate failure of communism is not in government, but in a destruction of motivation. Contrary to John Locke's principle, communism entices people to rely on the fruits of another person's labor. So by the early 1900s, the sociologist Max Weber would weave into the social conscience the term Protestant work ethic. He believed Protestant religious or moral values drove much of the economic development in Western civilization. A few decades later, by the mid-20th century, John Dewey would insist that man's morals are not eternal truths. They exist and change based on evolving emotions and habits. From the late 20th century through the early years of the 21st century, we have seen American attitudes shifting on such divisive topics as genetic testing of the fetus in the womb with the prospect to abort, so-called recreational drug use, gay marriage, and enhanced interrogation techniques. As we conclude this brief and very elementary discussion of philosophers and their perspectives on morality and ethics, I want to draw two conclusions. First, many of the philosophers and social thinkers we discussed use the word ethics instead of morality, and others use the two interchangeably. As I suggested in the introduction, I think of morality as a word that is most often associated with religious doctrine, while ethics is the secular equivalent of morality. I think this can form an important stepping-off point for us. Regardless of any religious affiliations, it is possible for each of us to recognize our ethical standards do not have to come from the divine, but from ourselves or perhaps our associates, friends, or families. Secondly, as we have seen, all the great minds have bounced back and forth between absolutes and practicality related to ethics. The one thing that is certain is that we cannot be certain what ethics is, or at least not what it is for anyone else. Let us not think of that as a problem, but as another opportunity. In the struggle to understand morals and ethics, I want to understand their differences. Then perhaps we can benefit by placing morality in the category of evolving absolutes for group conduct, and ethics as the source for each individual achieving his or her potential. That will be a focus in our next 5 sections. For now, we must realize that conscience alone is not enough to temper moral behavior. Obedience to morality and law has never been universal. I also find it too easy to talk what is right until you have to walk what is right. We all can imagine ourselves calm and cool and collected until the plane hits an air pocket and drops several hundred feet in a couple seconds, and our stomach winds up where our brain used to be. Suddenly, we are no longer that rational being we thought we were. In fact, we have to recognize how emotions so often govern our moral or legal reasons for doing things. For most of us, we have been told vengeance is wrong. However, vengeance is a core emotion, and one path to regaining happiness, or, as some would say, closure. It may be as simple as getting back at a practical joker, but vengeance is so fundamental that it is even the basis of our criminal law. Unlike civil law, where the intent is to restore the injured party to the condition that existed before the incident, seldom is it possible to make the injured party whole after a crime. Indeed, sometimes the injured party is dead. But society demands revenge, not carried out by the injured party, but by the state itself. This cold sense of justice may seem to be carried out by an unemotional government, but the roots of this eye for an eye justice is strictly the emotional need for revenge. It is further believed that the thought of the state seeking revenge will emotionally distress with fear a would-be perpetrator. But of course, that emotion has not stopped everyone. My ultimate goal with this program, therefore, is to provide a process whereby we can, in fact, improve our approach to ethics without disregarding our fundamental emotions, and in so doing, improve our own chances for greater happiness and success. And that leads me to conclude the way I often do, parts of a program with a reality check. We have gone through very briefly many different views about morality and ethics. If we could have all the great philosophers in one room debating the issue, we would still never come to a single unified conclusion based on what they have said. So my reality check for today comes from Thomas Jefferson, who cautioned us that no one ever changed another person's mind by arguing with them. Therefore, I'm not going to argue about it. It is not Socrates or any of the sophists since. You are the expert on you, and you will ultimately be responsible for your own achievements, including your own ethical standards. See you next time for part 2.